Okay, this is a tutorial video going over simple FM synthesis and converting it into what's called fixed timbre FM synthesis. If you look in your week 2 examples, I have this FM fixed timbre example down here. You can check that one out when you want to. Then there is the also cool double index FM synthesis example. But to begin with, basic frequency modulation is an example I've got already up. It has 3 main parameters for the frequency content that we end up hearing, and then 1 parameter for the loudness content. If I dial in frequencies using MIDI units, it automatically converts them into frequencies for my main oscillator. Remember, with frequency modulation, you are modulating the frequency. So we have a fixed frequency around which a modulating oscillator is adding a range of modulation to that fixed value. So when we fix it at 261.6 and we add a changing value to that, the result is the oscillator which is creating the sound. The pitch moves up and down for that oscillator, and it moves up and down at a particular frequency and a distance that is relative to the amplitude of modulation. So if I bring up the volume here, and notice I'm using dB to RMS in order to convert from values between 0 and 100 to values between 0 and 1. So now I've got this middle C, and at slow frequencies of modulation, the result is really a vibrato. So we hear this movement of a pitch 5 times per second, 28 hertz range, plus and minus. Those 2 values can be changed, as well as this value. I could bring this up until we start to get a sound that's more like a chord, and the relationship between the frequency of modulation and the carrier frequency determines the pitches in that chord, basically. And then the number of pitches we hear is determined by the amplitude of modulation. So if this is really small, we don't hear any extra pitches, but as we increase the amplitude of modulation, we start to hear more and more until it becomes an extremely rich collection of overtones. Okay, so what is meant by fixed timbre frequency modulation? So I'll bring this back up in volume. Notice what happens when I change the frequency. I'll just play a major scale. So this will be C, D, F, G. So we get kind of a change in the timbre of the sound as we move up and down. It's even more obvious probably if I were to get this into a really perfect ratio. So I'll start with a pitch that's easy to work with. So 440. So if I set this to say 110, that is 1/4 the value of 440. So it's a perfect harmonic ratio, mathematically speaking. And you can hear how the tone is very pure sounding. Listen to how the purity of that relationship changes when I move this value. So it starts to sound more dissonant. Oops, forgive me. So the reason why is because the overtones that are produced in the system rely on their harmonic relationship to create the timbre that we hear. So when we change the fundamental or the center frequency, the carrier frequency, but we keep the frequency of modulation the same, we are altering that relationship from carrier frequency to carrier frequency. So like when I go up one whole step, we no longer have that perfect 1/4 relationship between those two values. So when we create a fixed timbre FM model, instead of determining the frequency of modulation directly, we determine it as a function of the carrier frequency and an index of modulation. So what I've done is I've made a new value here, and I will create a regular multiply, so not tilde. I'll take my index of modulation and I use it to multiply against the carrier frequency. And we use TBF because math objects in pure data only change their values when the leftmost inlet receives a changing value. So if I had, for instance, this disconnected and change this, nothing happens. I'm going to set it back to 1 right now. But when I use the TBF object, what this does is it takes the incoming value, outputs it the right outlet of the TBF object, then outputs a bang from this left inlet, all at the same time. But in logical time, this happens first, then the bang. And that resends the value that has been sent to this multiplier from this number box. So now when I set this to, let's set it to 60 to start with, and set this to 1, now my carrier frequency is 261.6, my index of modulation is 1 multiplied by 261.6. That sets my frequency of modulation also to 261.6, but I can now change this dynamically, and you can see that the frequency of modulation changes with it when I move this. So if I set this to a very simple harmonic ratio, we hear that octave, or rather that fifth, in this really, or sorry, no, yes, the fifth. And then if I change this, the timbre stays the same, but the frequency of modulation has changed, but it's in relationship to the carrier frequency. So now I can change this, and it's always giving me a new frequency of modulation. And I can set this to something a little different, and it keeps those harmonic relationships parallel. Then within that relationship, I can add or subtract additional overtones with the integer relationships to that that carrier frequency relative to the frequency of modulation. So when you look at the FM fixed timbre example, you're seeing pretty much the same thing that I have there. So your carrier frequency, that's your MIDI pitch. I've got the modulation amplitude here, it's right here in this example, and I have a modulation index here, and it's right here in this example. And then finally, I've got volume control there. This lets you visualize all of that in a nice way, and I'll just turn down the volume a little bit, set you to 58, set you to, no, so it doesn't like me running that many things at once for some reason. But so this is the basic idea behind fixed timbre FM synthesis, and you can use this example in your homework if you want. And then I ask you to basically dial in a timbre that you like, and then alter one of these values over time. So you would use a line object to do that, along with a message and perhaps a delay object. Okay, if you have questions, please feel free to contact me.